This video was brought to you by the TLDR store. Support Scottish independence or the Union by grabbing our new pins. The link's down below to get a 10% off code with ScotIndie. A couple of weeks ago we made a video outlining the reasons people might back Scottish independence. So today we're going to have a look at the other side of it. So the three arguments we're going to have a look at are: firstly, the post-Brexit border argument, secondly, the money argument, and thirdly, the currency argument. As always with these three arguments videos, these aren't intended as an exhaustive list of arguments against Scottish independence, they're just ones we've chosen. Equally, we're not endorsing any of these arguments, we're just presenting them. Disclaimers aside, let's get into it. So, argument number one, the border argument. This argument is relatively simple. In the 2014 independence referendum, Scottish nationalists argued that there wouldn't be any hard border between England and Scotland because, at the time, the UK was in the EU. Scotland's plan was to leave the UK, then join the EU, which would mean regulatory alignment between England and Scotland, as both would have been part of the EU single market. Sure, it might have been a bit complicated if Scotland ended up using the euro, but nothing insurmountable. Obviously, post-Brexit, that's not really the case anymore. If Scotland wants to go independent and join the EU, and that is the plan, then there will have to be some sort of regulatory border between England and Scotland, akin to the one between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Now, an English-Scottish border probably wouldn't have the same political tension as the GB-NI border, because unionism in Ireland obviously has a more violent history than unionism in Scotland, but it would still be a logistical nightmare. There are 21 rail and road crossings between Scotland and England, all of which need some sort of border infrastructure, and there would have to be way more checks than there are currently in the Irish Sea. This is because the Irish Sea border works on an at-risk basis. Essentially, some goods don't need to be checked if they're deemed not at risk of continuing into the EU single market. Obviously, because Scotland would actually be in the EU, any goods going between England and Scotland are definitely going into the single market, which means there wouldn't be any at-risk exemptions. Everything would need to be checked. This would be particularly bad because Scotland relies heavily on trade with the UK, and if we've seen anything from Brexit, it's that regulatory borders reduce trade. In fact, estimates from the Centre for European Reform suggest that UK-EU trade has fallen by 14% thanks to Brexit. The other option would be for Scotland not to join the EU, but this would severely limit Scotland's regulatory flexibility and isn't currently SNP policy. So, that's the border argument. Let's move on to the money argument. The money argument is essentially that an independent Scotland would be poor. As things stand, Scotland runs a fiscal deficit of about £2,500, which means that Scotland receives £2,500 in government spending more per person than it pays in taxes. This is largely because government spending by region is determined by the Barnett formula, which tends to send more money to poorer regions like Scotland and Wales. Given that the average GDP per capita in Scotland is about £30,000, this means that Scotland is currently running a budget deficit of around 8%, which would have been by far the largest in the EU in 2019. Things haven't got any better over the pandemic. Scotland's national deficit would have been as high as 22% in 2020 to 2021. If Scotland wanted to join the EU, it would most likely have to bring that down to 3%, which would amount to a £1,500 drop in per capita public spending. And it's not clear Scotland could afford such a drop, because Scottish public services are already strained. Scotland's PISA scores, which measure educational attainment, are already pretty low compared to the rest of the UK, and Scotland has some pretty scary health outcomes. Pre-COVID, from 2017 to 2019, Scotland had a life expectancy of 79.1 years, with 77.1 years for men and 81.1 years for women. For context, this is about a year below the rest of the UK, at 79.9 and the lowest in Western Europe. These numbers get even worse when you zoom into specific areas. For example, those born in Glasgow City could expect to live just 73.6 years, about the same in Vietnam. The point is that an independent Scotland would have to significantly reduce public spending, and it's not obvious that Scottish people could afford this. The last argument against independence that we'll mention is the currency question. Now, this often gets complicated pretty quickly, but the basic idea is pretty simple. What currency should an independent Scotland use? Given that the official SNP plan is to join the euro, and given that an independent Scotland won't be able and won't want to negotiate a eurozone opt-out, then the answer to this question is eventually the euro. Nonetheless, even if an independent Scotland decides it wants to use the euro, it'll be a while before that actually happens. EU accession takes a minimum of 3 years and on average 5 years. And these numbers are slightly misleading because, as the EU has got larger and more complicated, the joining process has started to take longer. For example, Iceland, the most recent comparable country to apply for membership in 2009, took a year simply to secure the opening of negotiations and had completed negotiations on only 11 of the 35 chapters when it suspended its application in 2013. And Iceland was already part of the EEA. So, what currency would Scotland use in the meantime? Well, in 2014, the plan was to continue using sterling as part of the formal monetary union with the UK. The rest of the UK weren't particularly keen on this, because it would probably increase the cost of borrowing for them, which is why the leaders of all three main parties at the time rejected this idea outright. In 2018, the SNP's Sustainable Growth Commission proposed that an independent Scotland should just use sterling without a formal agreement with the rest of the UK. Unfortunately, this would mean that Scotland wouldn't have any monetary sovereignty, i.e. no say on interest rates or quantitative easing, and would probably mean higher borrowing costs. This is because when the UK borrows, investors know that the UK central bank can always print the money and pay it back, so they're happy to lend money relatively cheaply. If an independent Scotland were to borrow sterling, they wouldn't be able to provide the same guarantee, which means that investors need higher interest rates to accommodate for the increased risk. This is why in 2019 the SNP decided that their plan would be to only use sterling temporarily while they switched to a new Scottish currency. But even then, this wouldn't be easy. It takes time to transition to a new currency. It took Europe about 2 years to adopt the euro, for example. And at the same conference, the SNP also signed up to what are known as the 6 tests, recommended in the Sustainable Growth Commission. Essentially, they won't change currencies until the following 6 tests are met. Number 1, sustainable debt and deficit. Number 2, a credible central bank. Number 3, meets the need of people and businesses. Number 4, enough foreign currency reserves. Number 5, fits our trade patterns. And number 6, decoupled from the rest of the UK's business cycle. During this transition period, Scotland would have the same issues mentioned a second ago, and even then a new currency won't solve the problems. It's likely that a new currency will be weaker than the pound, which means that borrowing in debt services would become more expensive because of Scotland's debt, including whatever UK-wide public debt it agrees to take on post-independence, is denominated in pounds. It's unclear what happens with the euro as well. Would Scotland just not join the euro, or do 2 currency changes in quick succession? And how would Scotland meet the EU's convergence criteria, which require that any candidate country's currency holds stable against the euro for 2 years? Hopefully you get the point. It's unclear what an independent Scotland does with its currency, and there are no easy answers here. What do you think of these arguments though? Do you buy them? What arguments would you make in favour of the Union? Comment below or join the conversation on the TLDR Discord, it's linked below. Like I said at the start, this video is brought to you by the TLDR store. Over there you can pick up our countries with shoes pins, including Scotland and the United Kingdom collection, featuring new designs of Wales and Northern Ireland. These are just some of the badges on offer, so click the link below to head to the store. Also, don't forget code SCOTINDIE for 10% off your order. Thanks for supporting the channel. Also, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified every time we release a new video. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible, and if you want to see your name at the end of videos then sign up by clicking the link below.